and welcome back to the Pregnancy and Postnatal Entrepreneurs Collective podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Jenny Turner, who is a clinical psychologist and founder of Mind, Body, Soul Psychology in North Yorkshire. So Jenny offers in-person and online support across the UK with over a decade of NHS experience and now in private practice. But I'm going to let Jenny tell you a little bit more about the actual work that she does herself. So welcome, Jenny. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Neve. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So tell us, before we get into what you actually do, tell us a little bit about how you got to the place where you're doing the work that you do.
Okay. So I started, I guess, back in my undergraduate degrees, becoming fascinated with psychology and ended up following that path through. But when I was younger, sort of that was in my late teens, early 20s, I wasn't sure I wanted to be an actual psychologist. That felt a bit grown up for me. So I did a lot of sort of researchy psychology jobs back then. I also got a degree in neuroscience at the same time. And again, that was my sort of, I don't want to give up the sciencey research bit to be a psychologist. So I did a bit of both. And then it was in my late 20s that I was working at a research institution in London, but my boss there was a clinical psychologist and so had the experience of working with clients and suggested that that might be something that I would be interested in as well. So that's how I sort of found my path into clinical psychology. And then once I was qualified, I did a 3-year doctorate in clinical psychology. Once I was qualified, I found a passion for working in children and family services. So in the NHS, in child and adolescent mental health CAM services. And then I did that for a few years and then moved across to pediatric psychological services. So within hospitals with young people, I worked predominantly with respiratory conditions or heart conditions and their families. But in the work, there was a sort of expectation that because we were in a child-based service that we would often work with the child. But I found that actually the most effective way that I could support a child was to actually work with their main carer. So in most cases, that was the parent, and in most cases, that was the mum, because it tends to be the mums that bring the young people into the appointments. And so I would be meeting with them and they would happen to mention the stresses that they were having, the similar experiences of, for example, anxiety or low mood or low self-esteem that they had experienced as a child and that were still affecting them now. And so I began offering a lot more work to the mums themselves. And what I found with that is that when you care for the carer, everyone that the carer is caring for tends to do better, just quite naturally, because we all live in these ecological systems of family and how we all feel impacts on each other. And in a nutshell, I worked very hard in the NHS for a very long time and I burnt out. The demands of the job always outstripped my resource. And I don't think I was alone in that. I could see it happening to lots of my colleagues. And so I made the decision in my late 30s to leave the NHS and set up my own private practice. And in doing so, I thought really carefully about how to create a sustainable practice that would nourish me as much as I needed to put energy into it. How could I also be nourished through it? And so I specifically worked with the client group that I felt most passionately about, which is mums. So that's what I do now. I offer private clinical psychology services to mums and also more recently to professionals who are also in a caring role, because I've noticed like I sit with both of those hats on. I'm a mother and care for my son, and I'm a caring professional offering care to carers who are caring. And so there's this real ripple effect, isn't there? And the dynamics of when we are in relationship with someone offering them any form of care, the dynamics are similar. Obviously, the specific challenges may be different in mothering versus working, but the dynamics, what you bring to it, what gets in your way of offering that care that balances with their own care of yourself, that those dynamics are really common across.
Absolutely. And I think your story of working in the NHS and then going into private practice will be one that many of my listeners will understand. So a lot of people come from working in the health service and then come into birth work as a private practitioner, or come from their own experiences and then come into birth work as a private practitioner. So
Yes.
that experience of burnout would be quite common, where people who, in my line of work, mainly midwives, so people working within the maternity services, are at that point where, just like you said, I can't do this anymore. Your resources are outstripped, I think, is the way you described it.
Yeah.
And will often come into working for themselves for that reason.
Yeah.
And it being a completely and utterly valid reason, but obviously we would hope that our services wouldn't push people into having to do that. But at the same time, I think a lot of people find, when they do start to work for themselves, that the benefits, even if they felt pushed into it, that maybe the benefits are often things they hadn't considered so much. Would that have been something that you noticed?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I was more scared to go into private practice than anything else, actually. Yeah, I think that's what kept me so long in a job and I had several jobs in the NHS and several different NHS trusts. And I would say I, reached a point of, I can't keep working like this in several different roles in the NHS. Yeah. And I think I stayed there for so long because of the fears that I had of not knowing enough to run a business, not being business minded enough, not having enough qualifications, not, knowing nothing about marketing, all of that. And that's, sort of like, that's for other people to do, not for me. I'm just going to stay here. And there is something comfortable about having a salaried job, but we have to weigh that up with the costs. I think that's a really, like, the benefits and costs is a really lovely way of saying it, that actually nothing is a benefit without a cost and nothing's a cost without a benefit, is it? So while there was comfort in staying where I was in the NHS, there were many, many costs, and it got to a point, there was a real tipping point with that, I think. And the benefits of working for myself now, I mean, and I must say I'm aware of my privilege that allows me to have had flexibility to leave, to set up a private practice, to learn as I went about marketing and things like that. So I do think that's an important context for people to be aware of. And I've worked really hard on things like my self-care and my boundaries and knowing myself and my values and my integrity, and building a business consciously that allows me to live within all of that, which in itself feels more nourishing than what I was doing previously.
And I think for me, I would have had similar experiences coming out of a social care job, deciding to go into private practice, and that the fear there of, how do I replace my salary? And then, as you said, the privilege of having a cushion that allows you to do that. Then when we do make these leaps, there's that excitement of the newness and the learning. But then we go into a different set of costs and benefits, where if we're finding the running of the business aspect of it quite hard, or we're finding that we're working with quite a lot of difficult cases and that's quite hard. So it could be either or both. That, because sometimes the fear of needing to succeed can make us work really, really hard. And then our self-care gets dropped off.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that when we move from an institution and a salary into our private practice, it is really exciting. And we always bring everything with us, that we have everything that got us caught up in that recipe for burnout in the industry, we bring with us. So many of us, as you say, bring with us a fear of failure and a need for success and ideas about money and success and sustainability. And we also bring a lot of internalized ideas about our worth. And so many of us in those institutions with a salary don't work super hard to earn more money. That's not an equation that works in those when you get a salary. But for some, then we what we don't realize is often we're working really hard for that sense of worth.
Mm-hmm.
And then we come over into private practice and suddenly there is an equation around how hard I work and how much money I get. And often what people are missing thinking about, reflecting on, is this sort of hamster wheel we get stuck on of just running for our worth all the time. And that can be something that is really debilitating in terms of our self-care, because if we don't believe on some fundamental level that we are worthy of care, that we are worthy of all the money that may come to us, then we will think we have to work super hard for it. And working super hard doesn't equate with good self-care, really.
Absolutely. And so how, people want to be successful, obviously. They want to earn a wage that supports them and looks after them and their families. They want to feel accomplished in their work. But often that strive comes at the consequence of not looking after themselves. So what kind of things do we need to consider or think about or do to help us with that?
I think that's a really big question. And I think that for every person, the answers will be different. I can tell you that for myself, there was a real pragmatic foundation of, is this the right time for me to go into private practice? And what sort of private practice could I build if I did go now? And there were times earlier in my life where I wasn't as financially privileged, and it would have been harder, and it would have been a recipe for me developing a private practice within which I did had to run myself into the ground and to try to make the money that I was earning and needing at the time. And so there is an element of being really honest with yourself around, what is my reality right now? What can I achieve? And might there be a better time in the future, particularly if I plan for it, which I think in retrospect, that's what I had been doing, sort of planning for it, getting some savings together, finding some stability in my living arrangements that meant that I could then afford to make that leap. So I think that ties in with the privilege. I think sometimes that comes to us and sometimes it's harder for people to have that context that feels like, okay, now I can do this. And for us as well, a big decision was moving to North Yorkshire. We were in Kent at the time that I made the decision, and I was working in London in the NHS. And then a big part of me having a business that feels sustainable is that we moved 200 and something miles north to reduce our monthly outgoings significantly. And that is an idea that I don't think we talk about a lot. I think that where we live and what our monthly outgoings are feel like non-negotiables for a lot of people. And I guess this is another part of my privilege, is that I've lived all over throughout my life. I was born in England, in Sunderland. I've lived in Australia. I've lived in London. I've lived in Kent. And what that's meant is that I've developed this muscle of moving when my life doesn't align with what I want it to look like. I move. When an opportunity comes up, I move. And that flexibility really allowed me to sort of bring that flexibility into the maths, the financial maths of like what I could earn versus what my outgoings would be, and how to take the pressure off what I needed to earn so that I could have a business plan that incorporated self-care and all of that together. So that's just an example from my own life, but there are so many different ways that individuals could.
I do think like it's something really interesting. So for your example, it was the moving to bring down your monthly outgoing so that you could build this thing that you wanted to do. And we can really get stuck in those mindset blocks of not being able, that our life is just the way it is and there's nothing that we can do to change it. I remember when I was working full time and I wanted to start taking more time on the business end of things, and someone suggested to me reducing my hours and work, and I can't do that. They won't let me.
Yeah.
And that was my but that was my own block.
Yeah.
Because when I did come up with a plan and present it to my employers, it was accepted.
Yeah.
So
Great.
it was
Yeah.
about kind of having to work around my own mindset blocks and thinking that I know you can only do things
Yeah.
this way. So I can only live
Absolutely.
here because this is where I live.
Yeah.
I couldn't possibly uproot myself for a whim.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's lovely language you're using. I couldn't possibly do that. Like whenever we find ourselves thinking, oh, no, I couldn't possibly do that. That's really specific language that is very often indicator of a mental block that we have, that there's some curiosity that could be brought to that thinking in terms of why do I think I couldn't possibly do that? When actually, if you think of the language you're using, a lot is possible in this world. But when we think that that possibility isn't something we could explore, then yeah, there's very often a mental block there.
And the other thing that you said about it is about this feeling of unworthiness and feeling that we're not worthy to move our family or worthy to decrease our wages so that we can try something that we enjoy, or worthy of quitting our job so that we can try this fanciful thing,
Resting. Yeah.
that can see, oh my God, you're going to run your own business. Wow. And coming over those blocks and thinking about even being compassionate to ourselves and help it, if we bring in some sort of level of self-compassion into that, can that help us with those feelings?
Absolutely. I would say self-compassion is the foundation of my business plan. I would say yes. And life, actually. Yeah. So I specifically learned about self-compassion as a practice in, I think it was about 2018, 2019. So not that long ago, really. And it's probably not a coincidence that it was 2019 that I quit the NHS and started building the business that I have. Yeah, I think self-compassion is absolutely foundational. And I know that before we were recording, we were talking about how self-care is so hard, and that very often what we're told is self-care just adds more to our to-do list, actually. And self-compassion is one of those practices that adds absolutely nothing to our to-do list. It takes zero time, and it takes zero, I mean, it does take some energy, but I think the energy that it gives you back absolutely outweighs the energy that it takes. And it's something you can do on the go, wherever you are. It's like a sort of friendliness that you bring to whatever you're doing. Yeah. And the model that I use is Kristen Neff's model of self-compassion, which she breaks down into 3 components, which is mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So mindfulness is just wherever you are, what you're doing, just notice how you're feeling. Notice if you're tired, if you're energized, if you're thirsty, if you're hungry. Notice if you want to sit down or if your trousers are a bit uncomfortable. Just notice whatever's going on in your body and your emotions. And then the common humanity aspects of the model asks you to remind yourself that you feel anything that's difficult, you feel that because you're human, because we're all human and we all struggle. And I think there is something when we are a carer for other people, there are really powerful dynamics that can happen from a psychological theory point of view, that often we can project our vulnerabilities into our clients, and we can feel that we are the ones that do not suffer or should not suffer. I think we're all aware we do suffer, but we have the ideas about, but we're the carers, we shouldn't suffer. And actually this really concrete practice of reminding ourselves that we are human as carers, and our clients are human as people who require care, and that actually we are on both sides of that equation at different times of our life. And for ourselves, we can be both. We can recognize in ourselves that I need care and I can receive care and I can give care to myself. And I think that that foundation of common humanity is really important. And that's where I really started with my self-compassion practice, to just say, oh, today is really hard. That's because I'm human. And everyone would find today hard if they were in this situation. I've had all this stuff to do. I've had my mothering tasks are going through the roof, home care tasks going through the roof, client care tasks going through the roof. This has been a really hard day. Oh, that's human. I'm meant to find this hard. It's really human to find this hard.
I really love that concept, because I think it's really something people will be able to resonate with when they think about it, because a lot of the work that we do with parents is in the early postpartum period where everything is hard. And I will often say to parents, it's okay that you're finding this hard, because it is. You know what I mean? Everyone finds it hard. We were never meant to parent in a 2-adult family. We were supposed to have lots of adults available to mind this tiny baby, not just 2 adults. And as practitioners, we're given that to our clients, but sometimes we need to remind ourselves that this common human experience that you're talking about, that if I often describe it as, well, if a friend was telling you their problem or what they're struggling with, what would you tell them? And when we talk to ourselves how we talk to a friend, or if we can try and talk to ourselves about how we would talk to a friend, then everything has a different light on it.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the third component of self-compassion, which is self-kindness. And that's often, the example you've just used is often used in Krista Neff's training. So how would you speak to a friend? You would speak to a friend with kindness. You wouldn't say, come on, pull yourself together. There's nothing wrong with you. That's often how we speak to ourselves. We would speak to our friends with kindness, and the invitation is to speak to ourselves with kindness. And I must say, for myself, I've found that harder. I have grown up with, for lots of complex reasons, quite a harsh critical voice about myself in my mind. And so had I come to self-compassion and had it been all about self-kindness, I'm not sure I would have been able to run with it, because it was too big a leap for me to be kind to myself. So, but I could start with mindfulness. I could start with noticing how I felt, and I could then start with common humanity. I could then start with saying, maybe this is human. Maybe this is hard because it's hard, as you say, and because we're not meant to be humans in this context. Maybe I'm being pushed more than any human really should be. And only when I'd practiced those two things did self-kindness then come. And it still doesn't come. I know some people are so beautiful with self-compassion and can put their hand on their heart and say, I love you, and speak really these gorgeous words to themselves. That's not me. I'm more like, oh, it's okay, Jenny, try again tomorrow. And even that is so much more kind than I used to be. So it's about taking these ideas and making them accessible for us as well. So making them work for us.
Absolutely. And something was coming up for me when you were talking about the common humanity. So in one way, it's a really simple concept. You know what I mean? We think we're human. Okay, other people experience this. But what I often find with some clients who are building their businesses is they start then comparing themselves to other people. So they feel, well, if they can do it, why can't I? If they can do it, why am I struggling? So how can we help people with that sort of thought process?
That's so common. My goodness, I struggle with that too. So I learned about self-compassion through a different model, which I think is relevant here. So I learned about self-compassion through Brené Brown's model of shame resilience. And I learned it through reading all of Brené Brown's books. And then I went over to the US in 2019 to train with her company to learn the model and how to facilitate it with other people. So her model of shame resilience would suggest that the feeling that is driving that comparison is shame. And once we can label that as shame, then there's this whole toolkit that we can have at our disposal to work with that shame, to bring it into our consciousness, because so often shame hides in our shadows. And then I would argue that actually most people listening to this would say, I don't really have a lot of shame. I don't really experience a lot of shame. Because I think in our culture and our society, we don't talk about it as being a universal human emotion. We talk about it more as being reserved for people who have, really terrible behavior, as in you should be ashamed of yourself, or we talk about it in terms of really terrible situations that people have found themselves in. So, for example, specific types of trauma that have a lot of shame attached to them. And we can accept shame in those guises. But what we find harder in our society is to acknowledge that actually, no, in my day-to-day life, even when there's no traumas, even when I haven't done anything terrible, shame drives this emotional car of mine quite a lot of the time. But because of the nature of it, I keep it in the shadows because shame is so shameful. I don't acknowledge I have it. I keep it hidden. I keep it in the shadows. But what a lot of people that I speak to about shame do identify with are the ways that shame is driving our emotional car without us calling it shame. So one example is as you've described, Neve. I look at someone else and I think they're doing it. Why can't I do it? What's wrong with me that I can't do what they're doing? So that's any way you're comparing and you're coming out on the bottom, that is likely to be driven by shame. Another example is when something has to be perfect or it doesn't feel good enough. And I know that for so many of us building our own businesses, perfectionism can really paralyze us. And it's hard because we do want things to be very good, very effective, but it can be hard to tease apart what is healthy striving and what is perfectionism. And I think, again, an awareness of your shame and your shame triggers can be so powerful in discerning the difference between those two.
I think this is a really important conversation because I think we wrap these things up in these funny little bows. So we'll call it imposter syndrome and then try and put it to the side. Yeah. Or we'll call it, oh, I'm just a perfectionist, and try and minimize what's actually happening underneath the surface first.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's absolutely right. We call it different things. So we call it imposter syndrome, we call it perfectionism, we call it anxiety a lot of the time, that feeling in you that wants to speak out in any, I'm thinking of my time in the NHS and I would want to speak out in a meeting to challenge something, but I wouldn't. And I would put that down to anxiety, but actually it was shame. It was a voice somewhere deep inside of me saying, well, who really wants to hear from you? You're not very important in this room. Why do you think your voice is relevant here? Just stay quiet, stay safe. And I think that's important to acknowledge as well, that shame does want us to stay safe. It's a functional emotion, but when we don't work with it consciously and intentionally, then it can just take over and it can keep us very small and very silent and very hidden. And I think it's a particularly important emotion for workers in the birth space to understand, because shame and motherhood go hand in hand. They shouldn't really, but they absolutely do in our culture. So many people don't talk openly about their birth experience. And I would argue that because it didn't go as they thought it should go, that it didn't go in a way that paints them as a perfect earth birth mother where everything went, as it should do. And I'm doing this in inverted commas because none of that is true. But these are the stories that we hold that mean we feel shame around our birth and around our experience of mothering, and then that keep us quiet and keep us from sharing experiences. And there is obviously an overlap as well with when you're building a business, that you have all sorts of ideas about how it should go, how easy it should be to get clients. And I think that, I'm using the word should a lot, and that's another big clue. If you're thinking in your mind, this should be easier, I should be better at this, anything where you're shoulding all over yourself, that's very often shame that is driving that.
So when we start to kind of understand that this is where it's coming from, how do we tackle it in the day-to-day, or how do we build our own resilience or bring ourselves out of this shame spiral, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be like a spiral. So I think the most important thing is and this is where the self-compassion model really overlays within the shame resilience model. I think it's about being mindful and beginning to notice when these messages are coming up, like shoulds, like internal critic messages, like imposter syndrome messages, and just notice. And then be really kind to yourself. Remember your common humanity. Remind yourself that shame is a universal human experience. it does not mean there is anything wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling this way, for struggling in this way. That's all really normal. I think that's the most important first step. Yeah. And I think also Brené Brown's model talks about the importance of recognizing the difference between shame and other feelings. So, for example, a big one is guilt. So I believe that particularly in the mum space, we talk about mum guilt, for example, but actually what we're talking about is the shame we feel as a mum that we can't do it all, or that we need a break from our children, you know. And so I think the difference between shame and guilt is very, very important. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And that's for each individual person, really, to bring that mindfulness. And, you know, whether it's journaling or just reflecting and thinking about it and thinking, actually, this does feel different. And a really helpful heuristic for the difference is guilt says, I am worthy, I'm a good person, I'm a good business owner, I'm doing really well, and I've done something, I've engaged in some behavior that makes me feel bad. So I'm going to change that behavior in the future. Whereas shame has a very different flavor. It more says to you, I am bad. I can't do this any better. It doesn't matter how hard I try. There's something wrong with me. And so guilt comes from a place of worthiness. Shame fuels unworthiness.
I think that's a really clear explanation, actually, and really helpful for everybody, really, to kind of have that differentiation between the two. And then when we're being mindful, to say, well, which is this? Yes. You know, where am I landing with this? Because our response will be different, I suppose, depending on, is it the worthy, and it's just, I did something that's out of character or that I feel a bit bad about, and I'm sorry, and I'm going to try differently. Or there's the self-critical, just putting yourself down, the perfectionism, the comparison element, which both need kindness, but in a different sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably been the most important aspect, I think, for me, of recognizing and then naming it as shame. So bringing it out of the shadows, as Brené Brown would say, to actually bring it front and center and say, yes, I think this is shame. I think I'm dealing with shame here in myself. I think I've been triggered. My shame has been triggered to come up here. And then it's about working to the way we build resilience to shame. And I think that's a really important word, because we can never eradicate shame. We only ever can work with it. And so the way we work with it is to do all those things we've said, sort of be mindful, notice it, differentiate it from other feelings, bring it to the foreground, call it shame, get to know it intimately. And then what fuels shame from the Brené Brown research is secrecy and silence. And what makes shame shrink is empathy and compassion and connection with other people, and discovering that you are not alone. Shame will make you think that it's just you. And so the way that you build resilience to it is by having the courage to say, is this just me? I struggle in this way. I've had this feeling, which I think is shame, really triggered in me, and asking someone really trusted, do you also feel this too? And hopefully you can then get an empathic response of someone saying, yes, me too. And you're not alone. And that confirms all of your self-compassion practice, your common humanity. It helps to shrink the shame, because shame grows exponentially when we keep it hidden and when we think it's just us and we don't tell anyone about it. But at the same time, this model can then get quite complex, because what we need to remember is that every single other person also has shame and also has their own set of shame triggers, and that every person's shame triggers are different from every other person's shame triggers. And so what's a really important thing that I keep in mind all the time is that I have a network of people who I might go to when I struggle, but some of those people I can't go to with particular shame triggers, which I've learned through trial and error. And the trouble is if you don't know this, then you might go to someone for example, you might go to another new business owner and say, oh, I had like 0 inquiries this week, and I just feel like I'm not doing a good enough job. And you might talk to that other business owner that goes, oh, really? I've had 50 inquiries this week. I don't know what you're doing wrong. And then suddenly your shame doesn't get empathized with. Mm-hmm. The person has absolutely set themselves up as doing far better than you. And then you feel more terrible. And I think that's, again, you lean back on self-compassion. Oh, that was really hard. It's not about me. This is human to feel even worse when you open yourself up and someone comes back with something that doesn't confirm your experience. And then to not give up on that idea that there are people out there who A, have had a hard week as well, and B, are also brave enough to admit it. Because the thing about that person that says, oh, I've had 50 inquiries this week, we don't know if that's true or not. Mm-hmm. Some people may have such strong shame triggers that they can't be honest about their vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And so we need, part of the model, and the resilience model, is building this awareness of how each person also has their own shame stuff going on.
I think that's really important, because like I said, if we do go to someone and we don't get the response, that helps us feel better. At least if we know that this is a possibility, and that it still doesn't make it our fault, and it still doesn't make it that we were wrong, and that we can then work on different ways of caring for ourselves. So is there anything kind of final that we didn't discuss that you feel is important, or that you'd like to bring forward?
I mean, it's all so complex, isn't it? I could talk to you for so long about it. But I think one thing that I always come back to for myself when I think of self-care is that it's the really basic foundational things. So we've talked a lot about self-compassion and shame resilience, which are really cognitive ways that we think about ourselves and think about our struggles. And there are so much really basic things for our body that we can also be thinking about as we're moving about our day that don't really take, they do take a little bit of time, but they don't take too much time. So things like really fundamental human needs, like we need sleep, and we need water, we need hydration, and we need good nutrition, and we need light, sunlight. And sort of remembering, again, this is sort of, I've got into this way of thinking through that idea of common humanity, actually. Like, so what is it that humans need to function? We're all human. And I think often we overlook these really basic needs throughout the day. And it's interesting, I was talking to another mum on the school run this morning, and we were talking about sleep, and she was like, oh, I'm my own worst enemy. I know I need to sleep, but I take my phone to bed and I'm on my phone for a couple of hours before I go to sleep. And I think that's really important for us as we're moving through our days, like noticing in that mindfulness, am I being my own worst enemy right now? Am I doing something that, although it feels good in this moment, does it serve my future self? Does it serve my business right now for me to be doing this? Does it serve my parenting for me to be doing this? Whatever it is you're working on. And I believe that part of self-compassion is being compassionate to our body and respecting what our bodies need, and making choices that are as much aligned with that as we can. I think that's a really important piece that's often overlooked.
I fully agree, and I think it's something that we all know somewhere, but not something that we all practice. And it's definitely only something that I have started working on in the last 8 months of my life, of really really prioritizing the fact that my body is my host, and I need to look after it. It needs to be minded.
Absolutely.
So, Jenny, if people want to find out more about the work you do, or reach out and get in contact with you, where will they find you?
So I'm on Instagram. My handle is Dr. Jenny Psychologist. I also write a Substack, and you'll find that at mindbodysoulpsychology.substack.com. And I have a website as well, which says a lot more about how I work, and that's www.mindbodysoulpsychology.co.uk.
Great, and I will put all of those links in the show notes as well. Well, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. It has been a really, really great conversation, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.